The warm, humid Caribbean wind at the end of 1798 carried not only the scent of salt and seaweed, but also a distinct taste of anxiety. A tense silence reigned aboard the American merchant ship, slowly making its way through the waves. The captain, glued to his spyglass, peered at the horizon, where a foreign sail had appeared. It was not a pirate ship in the usual sense, nor a British battleship. The flag was French, that very tricolor which until recently symbolized freedom and fraternity now became a harbinger of ruin. American sailors knew what awaited them: inspection, confiscation of cargo under a fabricated pretext, and possibly the loss of the ship itself. And the most bitter thing in this situation was that there was no one behind them. The young republic, the United States, possessed enormous commercial potential, but was absolutely defenseless on the water. The nation did not have a single cannon capable of responding to the challenge of the old European powers. This was a moment of absolute vulnerability, when the country's economic artery was constricted by a simple act of will from a foreign admiralty. It was at this point of powerlessness, in the salty spray of humiliation, that an answer was born that would forever change the geopolitical map of the world. What historians would later call the Quasi-War was not just a border conflict or a series of naval skirmishes. It was a gigantic, agonizing, and incredibly expensive experiment in creating a war machine from scratch. At that moment, no one on the deck of the merchant brig could have known that keels were already being laid in the shipyards of Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore that would become legends. No one suspected that this strange, undeclared conflict would become the catalyst that launched an irreversible chain reaction of technological, logistical, and economic ascent for an entire state. We stand on the threshold of a story about how the necessity of survival forced an agrarian nation to forge its first steel fist, clad in oak planking. The situation that had developed by the end of the 18th century was paradoxical. The United States, barely recovered from the War of Independence, had virtually disbanded its continental navy. The last frigate had been sold at auction as early as 1785. The logic was simple. The country had huge debts, and maintaining a regular fleet seemed an unaffordable luxury. However, the world was not going to wait for the young democracy to get on its feet. The French Revolution escalated into a global conflict, and America's neutrality became its vulnerable point. French privateers, acting with the permission of their government, began a real hunt for American merchants. Hundreds of ships were captured. Losses amounted to millions of dollars of that time, which for the fragile economy was tantamount to disaster. Diplomatic attempts to resolve the conflict failed spectacularly, known as the XYZ affair, when French diplomats demanded a bribe simply to begin negotiations. This was the last straw. The nation realized, without strength, law has no voice. But to say, we need a navy, and to build one, are two different universes. President John Adams' administration and the newly formed Department of the Navy faced a task of titanic proportions. It was not just about buying ships. It was about creating an entire industry that virtually did not exist on an industrial scale. It was not just about felling trees and sewing sails. It was about creating a supply system, developing a strategic doctrine, training an officer corps, and, most importantly, convincing taxpayers that these colossal expenditures were necessary. This was the first experience in U.S. history of large-scale resource mobilization for waging war on distant frontiers. The foundation of this new force was laid with the Naval Act of 1794, but it was the crisis of the late 90s that set the mechanism spinning at full throttle. The central figure in this process was shipbuilder Joshua Humphreys. His vision was revolutionary and at the same time pragmatic. He understood that America could not compete with Britain or France in terms of ship numbers. The USA would never have 100 ships of the line to form them up and overwhelm by sheer numbers. This meant quality was needed. Humphreys proposed a concept that was ahead of its time: to create frigates that would be stronger than any enemy frigate and faster than any ship of the line. If you cannot defeat the enemy by numbers, you must be able to escape the strong and destroy the equal. This doctrine demanded incredible engineering solutions. American frigates, such as the Constitution and United States, were planned to be longer and heavier than their European counterparts. But for such a long hull not to sag under the weight of the guns, special strength was required. Here, logistics, the invisible hero of any war, comes into play. Humphreys insisted on using Virginian oak, or, as it was called, live oak. This tree, growing on the coastal islands of Georgia, possessed phenomenal density and resistance to rot. It was so hard that axes literally bounced off it. But this oak grew thousands of miles from the northern shipyards. Organizing the delivery of this strategic resource became the first test for the national supply system. Lumberjacks had to be hired, willing to work in the malarial swamps of the South. Vessels had to be chartered to transport giant logs. Supplies had to be synchronized so that work at the shipyards would not stop for a single day. This was a logistical operation on a scale that the young nation had not yet encountered. Every frame, every keel required a complex chain of actions involving hundreds of people. It was here, in the forests of Georgia and on the Atlantic transport routes, that Americans learned to manage complex projects. This was the first lesson. War is won not only with guns, but also with the timely delivery of materials. Difficulties arose at every turn. Copper for sheathing the hull, necessary to protect against shipworms and fouling, was scarce. It had to be imported from England, which was an irony in itself, or domestic production had to be developed. It was during this period that Paul Revere, a hero of the Revolution, opened America's first copper rolling mill, fulfilling a government order. We see how military orders began to stimulate technological development. For the fleet to sail, the country needed its own metallurgists, its own rope makers, its own cannon founders. The economy of the coastal states began to transform. The shipyards of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Norfolk, Portsmouth became centers of attraction for capital and labor. Workshops, warehouses, taverns grew up around them. The money allocated by Congress did not disappear into the ocean. It settled in the pockets of American workers, farmers supplying food, and merchants. However, building a hull is only half the battle. A ship without a crew is just an expensive pile of wood. The internal conflict unfolded in the realm of the human factor. Who would man these new, powerful machines of war? American sailors were excellent traders, accustomed to freedom and profit, but military discipline was an alien concept to them. Remolding a free merchant sailor into a naval seaman required a strict system and talented officers. Benjamin Stoddert, the first Secretary of the Navy, understood this better than anyone. He personally oversaw the selection of captains, looking for those who possessed not only navigational skills, but also leadership qualities. Men like Thomas Truxtun and Edward Preble became the architects of the new naval culture. Truxtun, commanding the frigate Constellation, was a fanatic of discipline and order. He wrote the first instructions on tactics and signals, effectively creating the charter of the American Navy. His task was extremely difficult: to take a motley crowd, many of whom had never held a musket and did not know how to work with heavy artillery, and turn them into a single mechanism capable of operating under enemy fire. An invisible psychological battle was taking place on the decks of American frigates. A battle against drunkenness, a battle against illiteracy, a battle against fear. Officers had to instill in the crews a sense of superiority, a belief that their ship was better, their guns more accurate, and their cause righteous. Hidden within this internal restructuring was a deep philosophical conflict. The very existence of a permanent navy caused fierce debate in American society. Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, feared that a powerful navy would become an instrument of tyranny, draw the country into endless European wars, and bankrupt the treasury. They advocated for a mosquito fleet, small gunboats to protect harbors. Federalists, supported by Adams and Hamilton, saw wooden walls as the only way to ensure national sovereignty. This was a clash of two visions for America's future: an isolated agrarian republic or a commercial power projecting its strength across the ocean. The Quasi-War became a proving ground where these ideas were tested by reality. Practice showed that passive defense does not work. To protect trade, one must go out into the open sea. The turning point came when theoretical calculations and training maneuvers were replaced by the roar of real battle. On February 9, 1799, the _3_ under Truxton's command met the French frigate La Sergeante. This was the moment of truth. The French ship was experienced, its crew hardened in the battles of the Revolutionary Wars, but the American ship was the product of a new strategy. Truxton used his advantage in speed and maneuverability, and his gunners, who had undergone exhausting training, showed a higher rate of fire. The victory was convincing and swift. A year later, Truxton engaged an even more powerful adversary, the frigate La Vengeance. Although the French ship managed to escape under cover of night, it was so damaged that it was effectively put out of action. These victories had an enormous psychological effect. For the first time, Europe looked at the American flag on the mast not as a piece of cloth, but as a symbol of power. For Americans themselves, it was a revelation. It turned out that their ships, built from their oak to their designs, were capable of beating the best fleets in the world. The feeling of national pride that flared up in the ports when ships with captured prizes entered them could not be measured in money. This transformed public consciousness. Skepticism was replaced by enthusiasm. The Navy ceased to be an expensive toy and became the nation's beloved child. But behind the resounding victories lay a much more important systemic work, which forms the essence of our story. To maintain squadrons in the Caribbean, uninterrupted logistical support was required. Ships needed provisions: salted meat, hardtack, rum, fresh water. In tropical conditions, food spoiled quickly. The Navy Department was forced to create a network of agents in Caribbean ports, negotiate supplies, and establish ship rotation. This was a school of logistics, in which American quartermasters learned to plan operations months in advance. Mistakes were made. There were cases of supplying low-quality meat or rotten ropes, but each mistake was analyzed and led to stricter standards. A system of government procurement emerged with clear quality requirements. This raised the level of all agriculture and production oriented towards the Navy. Moreover, the war revealed a severe shortage of infrastructure. Ships were damaged and needed repairs. Careening, tilting the ship to clean its bottom, on the beach was dangerous and inefficient for heavy frigates. The necessity of building dry docks and full-fledged naval shipyards became evident. In 1799 and 1800, Congress allocated funds for the purchase of land to establish 6 government shipyards. This was a strategic decision. The state was not just ordering ships from private contractors, it was creating its own production base. These shipyards, in Washington, Norfolk, Portsmouth, and other cities, would become centers of technological innovation for centuries to come. Steam engines, new metalworking methods, and advanced labor management systems would be implemented there. The culmination of this period was not a final battle, but the signing of the Treaty of Mortefontaine in 1800. Peace was restored, but America emerged from the war a different nation. It entered the conflict as a victim and exited as a player. Yes, the fleet was again reduced after the war. The policy of economy took its toll. But the core remained. Most importantly, the people and knowledge were preserved. Officers who went through the school of the Quasi-War, Edward Preble, Isaac Hull, Stephen Decatur, absorbed the spirit of aggressive professional warfare. They learned not just to manage sales, but to manage combat. They understood the importance of discipline, the accuracy of artillery fire, and, importantly, the value of a quality ship. The lessons learned from this conflict extend far beyond military history. Here we see the birth of a model of state economic stimulus through technological projects. When the government set out to create a world-class fleet, it, unknowingly, launched a process of industrialization. The need for cannons developed the foundry business. The need for navigational instruments stimulated precision mechanics. The need for canvas, the textile industry. Taxpayer money flowed back into the economy through workers' wages and contractors' profits, creating a multiplier effect. Coastal cities flourished. Warehouses were full. Shipyards hammered axes from dawn to dusk. This was a clear example of how military needs can serve as a locomotive for progress. This period is particularly significant in the context of preparing for future challenges. The Quasi-War was a dress rehearsal for the War of 1812 with Great Britain. Had it not been for the efforts undertaken in 1798 to 1800, had those super frigates not been built and the officer corps not trained, the clash with the Mistress of the Seas 12 years later would have ended in the complete rout of the American fleet in the very first weeks. It was the Constitution and the United States, veterans of the Quasi-War, that would bring America glorious victories over British ships, shocking the world for a second time. The logistical chains developed in the struggle against France allowed the fleet to survive under the British blockade. The management system created by Benjamin Stoddart proved its viability in conditions of total war. The philosophical aspect of this transformation should also not be underestimated. The nation realized that pure isolationism was impossible in a global world. The ocean ceased to be perceived as an insurmountable barrier protecting against the problems of the old world. It began to be perceived as a road that needed to be guarded. There emerged an understanding that freedom of trade is ensured not by the goodwill of neighbors, but by the caliber of one's own guns. This was the maturation of a nation, a transition from the idealism of revolution to the pragmatism of geopolitics. Today, looking back at those events, we see in them a prototype of the modern military-industrial complex, with all its pros and cons. We see how crisis forces society to mobilize and make technological leaps that would have taken decades in peacetime. The history of the Quasi-War reminds us that security is not a state, but a process requiring constant investment, training, and improvement. Those oak frigates have long become museums or disappeared into the abyss, but the principles laid down in their construction, reliance on technological superiority, professional personnel, and reliable logistics, remain the foundation of any successful strategy to this day. Mentally returning to that merchant ship deck where we began, imagine how the captain's perspective changes 2 years later. Now, seeing a sail on the horizon, he no longer feels that chilling fear. He knows that somewhere nearby, the quote 0 or quote 1 is patrolling. He knows that behind him stands a system, from the logger in Georgia to the minister in Philadelphia. The sound of the wind in the rigging no longer seems threatening. It sounds like the music of progress. America went to sea, and, as history showed, it had no intention of returning. The waves beating against the hull now carried not anxiety, but the news of the birth of a new maritime power, ready to defend its interests anywhere in the world. The history of the development of the American fleet during these years is a story of how order and strength are born from chaos and necessity. It is a reminder that the biggest investments in the future are often made at times when the present seems most bleak. Those 2,500 oak trunks, transformed into frigates, became the currency with which America paid its entry ticket to the club of great powers. And although the cannons of that era have long fallen silent, the echo of those volleys still resonates in the structure of global politics and economics, reminding us that the path to prosperity often lies through the readiness to defend it by force. The depth of the changes that occurred becomes even more evident when examining the details of everyday life that transformed under the influence of naval needs. Take gunpowder production, for example. Before the Quasi-War, American gunpowder was of unstable quality, often damp and misfiring. This was acceptable for hunting, but deadly in naval combat, where seconds decide everything. The naval order demanded standardization. Chemists and manufacturers were forced to find new methods for purifying saltpeter, experimenting with charcoal and sulfur proportions. As a result, the quality of explosives increased nationwide, which later found application in mining and canal construction. The war spurred the chemical industry, forcing it to transition from artisanal methods to a scientific approach. Attention should also be paid to medicine. Naval service in the tropics was a constant battle against diseases: yellow fever, scurvy, dysentery. Naval surgeons were forced to develop new methods of hygiene and treatment. Strict rules were introduced for ventilating premises, fumigating holds with vinegar, and changing crew diets. These medical observations and practices gradually seeped into civilian life, improving public health in port cities. The fleet became a laboratory where the advanced ideas of the Enlightenment were tested under extreme conditions. Another layer often overlooked is the social lift. The fleet provided young people from less affluent families with the opportunity to build a career and receive an education. Navigation requires knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and geography. Midshipmen, future officers, were trained directly on board. This was, in essence, the country's first technical school. Many of those who went through this school later became captains of merchant ships, engineers, and politicians. The nation's intellectual capital grew through these young people who learned to calculate coordinates by the stars and operate complex sailing mechanisms. The economic effect spread in circles, like ripples from a thrown stone. Farmers in Pennsylvania and Maryland gained a huge and stable market. The fleet consumed thousands of barrels of salted meat, flour, and peas. This stimulated the expansion of cultivated areas and the development of preservation technologies. Packaging standards emerged. Barrels had to be of a specific size and quality to withstand long voyages. Coopering reached a new level. Thus, even a farmer living 100 miles from the sea and never having seen the ocean was economically linked to the success of frigates in the Caribbean. his well-being depended on how reliably the fleet protected the trade routes by which his grain was exported. It is also interesting to trace how the attitude towards the very concept of public service changed. Until this point, the federal government was something distant and abstract for most citizens. With the creation of the fleet and the accompanying infrastructure, the state became the largest employer and customer. People saw that federal power could be a creative force, capable of implementing large-scale projects. This strengthened the unity of the country, which was still a patchwork quilt of individual states with their local interests. The frigate, bearing the name United States, was a tangible symbol of this unity. A resident of Massachusetts and a resident of Virginia served on the same deck, protecting the interests of all states at once. This contributed to the formation of a national identity. A critically important element of success was also the flexibility of strategic thinking. Americans were not afraid to learn from the enemy, but they also did not hesitate to break the rules. The French and British traditions of naval combat were rigidly regulated. There were codes of honor, rules for forming a line. Americans, however, unconstrained by centuries-old traditions, introduced an element of pragmatic improvisation into tactics. Truxtun and his colleagues relied on the individual training of gunners, on aimed fire at the hull, unlike the French, who often shot at masts to immobilize the enemy. This focus on destruction, on maximum damage, became the hallmark of the American style of warfare: effective, tough, and technologically advanced. One must not forget the role of intelligence. To effectively combat privateers, it was necessary to know where they were based and what routes they took. American consuls and trade agents in the West Indies became a network of informants. Information became a weapon. The speed of data transmission about the movements of French ships allowed American captains to seize the initiative. These were the beginnings of naval intelligence, an understanding that situational awareness is as important as the number of cannons. Ultimately, the Quasi-War became a kind of accelerator of history for the United States. Processes that would normally have taken half a century were compressed into 2 or 3 years. The pressure of an external threat forced disagreements, bureaucratic red tape, and doubts to be cast aside. A model of effective interaction between the state and private business for a national goal was created. This model would be used by America again and again, in the Civil War, in the world wars of the 20th century, in the space race. The roots of this ability for rapid mobilization and technological response to challenges lie precisely there at the end of the 18th century, in shipyards smelling of fresh shavings and tar. When we look at modern aircraft carriers, which are the pinnacle of engineering thought and a symbol of global power, we should see in them direct descendants of those first 44-gun frigates. The genetic code of the American fleet, the pursuit of technological superiority, reliance on a powerful industrial base, and aggressive protection of trade interests, was written precisely then. Joshua Humphreys, Benjamin Stoddert, Thomas Truxtun. These people did not just build ships and win battles. They laid the foundation for the security architecture in which we live today. And perhaps the most important lesson that this era leaves us with is that peace is not guaranteed by weakness. Peace is the result of a balance of power, and the ability to defend oneself is often the best way to prevent war. American merchant ships ceased to be easy prey, not because the world became kinder, but because predators realized that the victim had grown teeth. This transformation from victim to a force capable of defending its rights became the main outcome of those turbulent years, forever changing the self-perception of the American people and their place in world history. Thus, amidst the sound of waves and the creaking of masts, the era of apprenticeship ended, and the era of mastery began, the fruits of which would be reaped by subsequent generations without even considering the price paid by the first builders of the American fleet.